In this section, we want to go to the Philippines and review one of the country's significant historical events. We want to talk about the People's Revolution in the Philippines in 1986, during which they managed to overthrow their dictator ruler after 21 years of governance. This revolution, known as the Yellow Revolution or People Power Revolution, was said to have amazed the world according to the media. Before diving into the story, let me first tell you a bit about the Philippines and its history. The Philippines is an archipelago in Southeast Asia. According to archaeological research, the first humans arrived on these islands about 70,000 years ago. However, the world remained unaware of this land until about 500 years ago, when it was discovered in 1521 by Magellan, a Portuguese navigator in the service of the Spanish Empire. After its discovery, the Spanish colonized these islands and named them the Philippine Islands in honor of King Philip II of Spain. The Philippines remained a Spanish colony for about 380 years until the late 19th century, when the people revolted against Spanish colonization to gain their independence. Simultaneously, the United States entered into war with Spain. With the cooperation of Filipino revolutionaries, they defeated the Spanish and expelled them from the Philippines. However, the Americans refused to recognize the Philippines' independence and instead took over control of the country themselves. Spain left, but the Philippines became a colony of the United States. The country remained under U.S. rule until the early stages of World War II, when it was occupied by Japan in 1942. This occupation lasted until the end of the war and Japan's defeat. Finally, in 1946, the Philippines officially declared its independence, establishing itself as a democratic republic. A system was introduced where the president would be elected directly by the people every 4 years. For about 20 years, everything seemed to go well until 1965, when a man named Ferdinand Marcos came to power as the new president. Marcos won 2 consecutive presidential elections. However, during his 8 years of rule, his policies led to increased poverty and social inequality, which sparked widespread dissatisfaction among the people. On the other hand, opposition parties, especially leftist groups, accused Marcos and his associates of corruption, large-scale embezzlement, and electoral fraud. As a result, protests and public discontent grew significantly during Marcos's second term. The Communist Party of the Philippines, which had gained a significant following among the people, even formed a military wing and prepared for a revolution. Marcos, seeing that the situation was slipping out of his control and that his term was nearing its end, and knowing that the law prohibited him from serving a 3rd consecutive term, declared martial law under the pretext of safeguarding national security against enemy conspiracies. Before this, he had held a rigged and theatrical referendum to claim that the people had voted in favor of martial law. He used this as justification to remain in power until the supposed crisis was resolved and the enemy was defeated. Following this, he began severely suppressing his opponents. Under his orders, hundreds of political activists and even members of Congress were tried and arrested. Many were sentenced to execution, while others were forced to flee the country. He shut down critical media outlets and severely restricted civil liberties. Most importantly, Marcos amended the constitution to expand his powers. During this time, his rule coincided with the Cold War between the world's 2 superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. To prevent the rise of communist groups in the Philippines, the U.S. supported Marcos. With this backing, Marcos confidently continued plundering the country and silencing any dissenting voices. Then, in 1983, Benigno Aquino, one of the opposition leaders, was assassinated. This event ignited the people's simmering anger. Aquino had been imprisoned for several years due to his opposition to Marcos. However, because of his illness, he was released and allowed to travel to the United States for treatment. He stayed in the United States for 3 years, but he couldn't take it anymore. Despite knowing that returning to his country could very likely cost him his life, he decided to go back. However, as soon as he stepped off the plane, a man dressed as an airport worker shot him, and he was killed. Aquino's assassination further fueled public dissatisfaction and anger against the government. Despite the government's denial, the people knew that the killing of Aquino was carried out under Marcos's direct orders. As public protests increased, opposition groups gradually gained more power. Meanwhile, the government faced severe economic challenges. The United States also no longer supported Marcos as strongly as before, and even pressured him to hold new presidential elections and end his dictatorial martial law regime. Finally, in 1985, under mounting pressure, the government announced its decision to hold the next presidential election. The first candidate to declare their candidacy was none other than 68-year-old Marcos himself. Even though he was suffering from a terminal illness, he refused to step down from power. Who was Marcos's opponent and the opposition party's candidate? It was none other than Mrs. Aquino, the widow of the late Benigno Aquino, who had been assassinated. After her husband's murder, Mrs. Aquino became incredibly popular among the people. Supporters showed their allegiance to her by tying yellow ribbons, which became not only the color of her campaign, but also a symbol of protest against her husband's assassination. Finally, in February 1986, the elections took place. Although all predictions pointed to Mrs. Aquino's victory, the results were shockingly announced in favor of Marcos, declaring him the new president of the Philippines once again. There was overwhelming evidence of widespread electoral fraud. The people could no longer tolerate it. Hundreds of thousands of people wearing yellow ribbons gathered to protest the election rigging. Alongside the street protests, many also participated in strikes. Even some government and military officials resigned. But Marcos, sticking to the typical playbook of dictators, ordered the arrest, suppression, and killing of the protesters. In a live television broadcast, he even declared that he would not step down from power and would eliminate anyone who stood in his way. But this time was different. None of the protesters left the streets, and their numbers kept growing. Marcos ordered the military to take to the streets with tanks and machine guns. However, protesters sat in front of the tanks and refused to move. Eventually, the soldiers disobeyed orders and refused to shoot their fellow citizens. Finally, even the military joined the people. With no other option left, Marcos and his family fled to the United States, taking with them millions of dollars in stolen wealth that had already been transferred to his Swiss bank accounts. On the same day, Mrs. Aquino took the oath of office as the new president, officially marking the end of the dark era of dictatorship. How long do you think this entire protest and revolution lasted? Just 4 days, from February 22nd to February 25th, 1986. On the 4th day, Marcos was overthrown and the people celebrated their victory. The Yellow Revolution in the Philippines is considered one of the most progressive revolutions of the 20th century. It achieved its goals with minimal violence and demonstrated that the unity of the people could overthrow any power.